Good afternoon. Hello again. This is Sixth Heritage Forum of Central Europe, Heritage and Development, directly from Kraków International Cultural Center, Main Market Square 25. We are finishing the second day of the conference, and after some part of parallel sessions, we will now finish this day with a lecture. I have a great pleasure to introduce to you our Lithuanian-Canadian author, Dr. Laimonas Briedis. Hello. We are very happy that you joined us, and that we will have a bit. I must say, a different topic than the previous ones, especially from today's morning when we heard about heritage-led diplomacy and heritage-led innovation. Vilnius Shadows, Heritage in Translation. Dr. Briedis is an author of a fascinating book. I hope it will be possible to see. Vilnius, City of Strangers. The book was published already in many languages, but unfortunately still is not yet available for Polish readers. I hope that soon it will be, the situation will change. Dr. Briedis is a writer and scholar of history, is a cultural geographer, a native of Vilnius, but lived mostly in Vancouver in Canada. And indeed, this book is, and I understand your research is more about cultural memory, or memories, or conflicting memories related to a place. And Central Europe, and probably Vilnius incline, resembles exactly this fact that in Central Europe we have many layers of different memories in many places, sometimes conflicting, sometimes overlapping, sometimes difficult, but always extremely interesting, but demanding a huge sensitivity and knowledge. So I'm very happy that we will be able to listen to your story about Vilnius. I must say that ICC for some years already we are developing lots of projects with Lithuania. We had in our gallery some years ago exhibition of Čiurlionis. We are preparing a new exhibition on Lithuanian photography. And this year, we will open also our own exhibition on photo books in National Gallery of Art in Vilnius. But also in our conference, there were many Lithuanian contributions, for example, by Dr. Ingrida Veliutė and some others. So this afternoon, Dr. Laimonas Briedis, the screen is yours, if I may say it like that. Please.
Well, thank you very much for your kind and very warm introduction. And so I can hear my echo. Is that better?
It's okay. We can see you and hear you.
You can hear me. I'm just hearing a very strong echo. So, so it's actually it's going to be relevant to my talk, but the echo is good. Yeah. So I am actually talking from Vancouver, where I live. So we have about 9 hours difference, and I guess it's in the afternoon there. So good morning, good afternoon. But my talk is about Vilnius, the city where I was born and grew up. And even if I more or less left about 30 years plus, all my work and sort of all my thinking in many ways, it's still attached to that city. And one thing that I want to say that the sort of distance of both in time and space, I think this is what shapes in many ways, like it or not, what shapes my approach to the city. And which, so I kind of work with the city both as in very intimate fashion, because I think I know the city quite well. And yet, as always, now in the last several decades, even, I have this distance too. So in the way, some ways, I feel that this is not necessarily goes against the grain in the way what Vilnius is, because Vilnius, in many ways, as you mentioned, is the city, I would say, of many, many memories. But more importantly, it's not necessarily memories, but I would say sort of narratives. And those narratives position Vilnius in a very different locations, if you want to call it. So in the way, as a cultural geographer, to me, the most interesting aspect of Vilnius and the most challenging aspect, because again, as you mentioned, in order to sort of enter Vilnius, you have to have a lots of baggage. And one of the baggages of obviously the linguistic baggage. So you have to read and understand and sort of operate in many different languages, 4, 5, 6 even perhaps. Now, I don't have all that knowledge, but nonetheless, this is always in my mind that so to speak, not to enter Vilnius, you have to carry this sort of linguistic world with you, or linguistic walls with you. And if just I may, sort of my approach on Vilnius is based on this more or less the constant notion of translation. And when I say translation, it's not just like translation from one language to another, but actually translations in different formats. And I'll talk about that, how translations perhaps change forms the city and what is the notion of translation. So in the way, I see Vilnius not just changing in itself as the city, every city changes, but it's in the constant process of translation. And one of the things is to sort of be aware of translation, obviously, is that there's always something is gained, and but always something is lost in this process of translation. So in the way, if you imagine city as a constantly moving somewhere and constantly changing its shape in this form of translations, so there's always something, so to speak, hidden and something discovered. So the true process of sort of hiding something, there's always a discovery, and vice versa. In the process, sort of kind of like in discovering, there's always hiding. And this brings the notion of visibility. So in the way, what is visible and what is invisible in Vilnius? And I try to relay this visibility very much through language, or with language rather, or languages of the city. So in the way, it's in summary, if you wanna talk, I see this Vilnius, at least at this moment for this specific topic. It's the sort of kind of like linguistic landscape of the city, and as a heritage. And we assume language is obviously more or less as a sort of like oral thing, but the reality is, if so much of the language is the sort of kind of like is based on visibility, both as a written language, but also as the different narratives placed in the city, and how those narratives kind of like reflect through the city. So even most people would say that we read cities, and I mean not just like maps of the city, but actually when we sort of walk through the city or whatever, we read cities. So in a way, this concept of visibility, heritage, and linguistic landscape, I think it's extremely acute in understanding both the past, present, and in fact the future of the city. So probably most of you more or less know what Vilnius is the capital of Lithuania, and this talk actually sort of it's initiated perhaps, or at least my thoughts initiated perhaps, is by the notion that Vilnius is going to celebrate or commemorate 700 years of its first recorded record, so to speak, written record about the cities in 1323. So this is perhaps like kind of introduction to think about those themes, about the linguistic landscape, heritage, and visibility, or this translation and visibility. in order more or less to prepare to conceptualize what other different forms other than just kind of commemorative forms or whatever, of this event in Vilnius, or most important, perhaps outside Vilnius should take, and how to see the city quite differently. So I will start actually from my hometown where I live, Vancouver, and I would like you to show what the language, so to speak, and visibility language issues are dealing in Vancouver. And just to remind you again that the Vilnius and Vancouver are roughly the same size in terms of population, actually, except for the fact that, of course, Vancouver metro area, it's always sort of kind of urban area. It's about the size of more or less like in terms of population of Lithuania. So, but the city itself, it's roughly the same as 600, 700,000 people, with one great exception, of course, that in Vancouver, there are perhaps about 100, I think 90 or 100 languages, sort of first languages or mother tongues, as they call it, people use it. And there is quite a great variety of linguistic diversity in the city. That is not necessary to diminish linguistic diversity of Vilnius, because Vilnius, by any standards, always been historically and currently a quite multilingual place. So this is, for Vilnius, this is not a novelty, so to speak, to be in the league of the cities that basically it's multilingual, not just bilingual but it's truly polylingual. So I will start my more or less introduction with a short, brief film, a video about Vancouver.
What do you call this place? The name that we chose in Hunt Communum is Lachen.
The name that was chosen by the committee and our council is Ashen. Ashen in Squamish is a new term that we've created for this plaza that means a place where people are invited to celebrate.
The meaning of the word Lachen is partly, Lachen is to invite, and Lachen is the place that you're invited to.
It's a place where people can come to celebrate, and it's very fitting for this site and the arts that happen here and all the wonderful things that take place here.
When you travel to other countries around the world, one of the things that really signifies that you're in another place is the language of the land that you're on. And I think that in a city like Vancouver that has committed itself to reconciliation and the strength of the people here, I think really it has an opportunity for us to be something better than we are right now. And that thriving Indigenous languages in the city of Vancouver makes Vancouver a greater city. The celebration of our Indigenous languages is what makes us a great city.
It's important that our language is put back on the land. I think it's important for people to realize that there's a deep memory here, and it goes back, thousands of years before there was any skyscrapers or concrete.
During a lot of the early years of the colonization of Vancouver, not a lot of thought or care was given into the existing society or government or people that had lived here for thousands of years. And so when the official renamings were happening for places in Vancouver, there was no thought given to the Indigenous people or our history or our culture or our heritage. So today, there's often a lot of thought played into concepts like heritage, but often that heritage prioritizes one particular form of heritage and erases the much older, longer history that has been here for thousands of years. And so when we have opportunities to do renamings and repatriations like this, it's about setting the things right, but also creating a different future that is celebrating our diversity and our strength.
To bring more understanding, hopefully, it brings more understanding of our Indigenous people that were here for a long time.
This renaming, or actually naming of different places in Vancouver, is a part of what they call a reconciliation. And as you can see, the Vancouver is part of this, what I call City of Reconciliation. Now, important thing to remember is that in Vancouver and British Columbia, the province where Vancouver is situated, is most of the indigenous land, not most, all of the indigenous land is, so to speak, is seized literally. So there was no treaty signed or anything like that between the colonizers and settlers and indigenous population. So in the way, it's everything, including city of Vancouver, is what is called nowadays on an unceded territory. So in the way, it is truly occupied by force, and in many ways, extermination of indigenous culture and people. So this process of reconciliation in Vancouver is very much now, it's a part of the city agenda, and not just kind of like in memory. It is important to know that about 2%, a little bit more than 2% of Vancouver's population self-identify as Indigenous people. So that's a relatively small proportion, but nonetheless, the process actually tried to sort of kind of bring the linguistic awareness of Native people, and there are several First Nations that still live and inhabit sort of like Vancouver area, into the place. What is challenging, and I think both in offering kind of new ways of looking at it, is the fact that, of course, the indigenous languages are so unfamiliar to all the sort of the rest of the population, to sort of to build the city in the settler notion based on the colonization, that anytime you see these names on the streets and squares, and so far actually only 2 squares were renamed, or name actually rather than rename, and so in the city, that this sort of unfamiliarity that comes from the local culture, it completely throws you out of or whatever, these sort of kind of like other people who are more or less immigrants into this area. So in the way, in the original First Nations names and expressions, the visibility of First Nations presence make you, including me, and most of the people of Vancouver, feeling that we are actually just foreigners, because the reality is we cannot read it, those more or less nice, unless we learn it. So there's a process of learning, so to speak, about the city, about your own city, that I think it's invaluable in any forms of sort of shaping the heritage. The biggest challenge probably is going to be in Vancouver, where the indigenous names, perhaps as it's proposed, might be used for 2-3 mass transit newly built stations. And so therefore there, it's truly perhaps would be quite challenging for people to sort of read, as you could see, this different alphabetic from unfamiliar from English or French, for example, with the critical markers, etc., etc. But if you build metro transit stations and whatever with the indigenous names, and you can hear that, and both you can read it, I think that's what is the beginning of this sort of kind of learning process, and sort of taken into indigenous cultures as part of the city rather than as a separate, which I think that's the key notion basically of what the heritage is. So now I will try to go back into Vilnius, return to Vilnius where it started, and my talk continue more about the Vilnius notion about this linguistic landscape and how it's been shaped. Just to understand that this is basically part of the heritage, and the way its city been shaped is through these kind of interactions between different languages. Now, first of the thing is that Vilnius was pretty much imagined in the 14th century as a wilderness. And when I said wilderness, because it's even in Germanic languages, in German language in particular, the city for up until almost like 18th century regularly was called the wilderness, which just literally means actually the wilderness. And in a way, it's the oxymoron, obviously, because it's kind of like places the city outside any kind of normal urban terrain. But what is always strikes the sort of early descriptions of the city is the abundance of and sort of kind of like polysemy of all these different cultural and linguistic kind of like elements in the city. So this is just a sort of a description from the 17th century, and I think it starts at like describing the city how it's uncivilized, making the point that there's a poor water, bad oil, and little beer in the city. So that's a marker of this is actually a German Lutheran's description. But the city also has many sorts of religions and sects, which pretty much always been identified with the different linguistics groups, all of which have their churches and public exercises such as Papists, Calvinists, Jesuits, Ruthenians, or Muscovites, Anabaptists, Zwinglians, and Jews, who also have their synagogue and place of gathering. Then there are also the Hetans or Tatars, and all the religious companies and sects have libertatem conscientate, or freedom of consciousness, in which no one is hindered. And it's the same in a way goes with the language. And the language is the same as a hinder that just, again, in the 17th century, I think 16th, 17th century, the city's records and sort of like the operation of the city was done in about 4 or 5 languages, which actually brings the notion that up until fairly recently, the city functioned as no part of not translation. There was no necessarily need to translate from one language to another things because all of those languages function pretty much simultaneously. And it's not just languages, as you can see, it's the kind of a religious aspects. Now, from the European perspective, this religious untranslatability, if you want to call it, was not looked as very positive thing. In most cases, Vilnius was compared to Babylon and Babylon and Tower of Babel, for example, in this linguistic. And so it wasn't looked kindly in a way that there's neither some sort of hierarchy nor ability to translate from one language. So in a way, the fact that there was no one ruling language was always considered to be a problem in the city because basically it was looked at as ungoverned. And again, just to give you an example, one of the most fascinating things about, for example, the 17th century Jesuit sort of parody of the city, how it functions. It was a parody of the Lutheran minister, actually, who claims that he prophesies in the sort of kind of languages that is made up language from 6 local languages. So if you know, for example, 3 of those languages, you can follow more or less the plot. If you know 4 of those languages, you can actually understand what the minister was saying. So in a way, this was obviously looked as some sort of kind of incomprehensible exodus of Vilnius. So here we come to this kind of notion that Vilnius heritage, this linguistic diversity, is in a way detrimental to what the city should be. In a way, it's not necessarily something to cherish. And just again to give you an example that what it was omitted from this is a map from the 18th century, late 17th century from Venice. And Vilnius is written as the only one place of the sort of in Europe, more or less, at least this part of Europe, where Vilnius is written is in 6 different languages. Now, what is absent, of course, it's the language of the Jewish population, which by the time already was speaking more or less Yiddish, not speaking more or less, but it was Yiddish speaking, although it's in religious aspects, obviously it used Hebrew and also communicated with other communities in different languages. So just to give you an idea how this linguistic diversity, or if you want to call this heritage, reach out to the world, just want to give you an example that there are many places in North America, in particular, called or named after Vilnius. Those are mostly small sort of name places, but nonetheless, if you can see, there's kind of like this linguistic sort of diversity where it's attached. So one of the most important places is in Vilna, in Jefferson County, in New York, and was called Vilna in 1813. Apparently, after the news of Vilnius taking over by Napoleonic army reached Northern America, actual America, and in that honor, the city was named Vilna. Ironically enough, of course, by 1813, the Napoleonic army was completely in shambles. Another place, for example, is Vilna, Ontario in Canada, which was named in 1858. And that city is, in a way, it was named after, because interestingly enough, that the most immigrants in that city are Kashubians, but that city was named after because the priest was from Vilna. And then there's the Vilna in Alberta, etc., etc. And there also is this very important cultural center, the Vilna Shul, for example, in Boston, Massachusetts, which has actually direct connection to the city because it was established by the immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Vilnius. Now, this linguistic diversity, one of the things, especially in the modern age, started to acquire a very hierarchical order. And this is where it starts to be like certain things start to become more visible and so-called invisible. Now, this linguistic diversity is, you can describe as what the language more or less has been used. This is the poster from 1916 from the German period during First World War German occupation, where, as you can see, probably for the first time in modern history, the city is kind of reflected in 5 different languages. So it's very clear that the German is dominating language, but what it replaced is in domination that you cannot see, obviously, is the Russian language that's replaced in a way. The German is replaced the Russian. And so by modern age, in the 19th century, we have like this quite hierarchy of language. So certain visibilities and invisibilities and whatever. So we not only have the lack of translation, so to speak, but what we also have, like this translation, when it occurs, it's a hierarchical order. One language is a dominating language, and the other sort of kind of like has to be ranked in a specific way. This continue up to the things that, despite the fact that this is from the interwar period when Vilna was part of Poland. And this is actually using Bulhack's photographs, the really kind of wonderful Bulhack's photograph for National Geographic article about Poland and Vilna at the time. And it says, actually, I probably misquoted here because it doesn't say Vilnius reads in many languages. Actually, it's Vilna reads in many languages. And it's similar to the time where Alfred Döblin, German writer, came to Vilnius for, as he would say, to look and find Jewish heritage of the city, or actually his own, perhaps, even Jewish heritage of the city. And what's striking in his discovery, or in his sort of a narrative about the city, encounter with the city, is the fact that when he looks around, he understands that the city has a very big Jewish population, and he even hears the, so to speak, Yiddish language spoken, but he doesn't see Jews. And the fact that doesn't see Jews is he kind of mentions that the reason why he doesn't see Jews is because they look like him. So in the way, the Vilna Jews are extremely modern, and so in the way it's sort of kind of like this discrepancy, at least in his mind, between language visibility and people who live in the city. So Vilna was operating, and Vilna is in Yiddish, the name of the Vilnius. Vilnius, in a way, acquired a role by that time, in the middle of the early part of the 20th century, as the capital of Yiddish land. Now, this is kind of like, arguably a contested what is the Yiddish land and what is the capital. And just to remind you again that the Vilna didn't have a very numerous Jewish population. About a third of the population at the time was Jewish and mostly spoke Yiddish. But because of its connections with other sort of like important Jewish centers, including Warsaw, but also New York and Buenos Aires and Berlin, etc., it's sort of like it was a gathering force of what could be called of the Yiddish land. So in a way, it wasn't the most important city in the sort of like Yiddish-speaking city, but it was the heart of the Yiddish culture for a very rather brief moment, for probably like the early part of the 20th century. And again, it is important to remember that in this part, what made Vilna, this capital of Yiddish land, it's not necessarily what was coming out of the city, in a way, in the production of their literature, but its connections over there, what it supported outside the city. So it's the connections, the heritage, in a way, Vilnius heritage of Yiddish heritage was already becoming more or less an international heritage, if you want to call it like that. Now it's again quite phenomenal to see. This is the Yiddish map of the city, and it's interesting to see that this renaming or naming city places or whatever in the city was always considered to be, so to speak, a top down. And just to give you another example, that when Lithuania took Vilnius in 1939. It implemented sort of kind of complete renaming of the city, of the place names and streets names, or whatever, based on Professor Briedis' actually kind of like a guide of Vilnius published in 1938 in Kaunas, where all of this was made up more or less as a fantasy. In 1938, nobody in Lithuania could seriously think that Vilna could be, or Vilnius could be potentially a Lithuanian capital again. So in the way, what Briedis like described in this sort of guide of Vilnius is a completely sort of created fantasy city. So a lot of street names today is based on this premise of sort of kind of wishful thinking, if you want to call that, actually materialized in the end of Lithuania. Now, in 1940, when Vilnius was visited by this one of the English labor union, trade union representative, she witnessed what she considered to be a takeover of the Soviets of Lithuania. And in describing this city, she was talking to the one of the American diplomat who expressed the sort of sentiments. This is starting from quote starting from Strong, and what I mentioned: whoever solves the problem of Vilna can solve the problem of Europe. So you can see the centrality, so to speak, of Vilnius heritage in the problems of Europe. Vilna is an insoluble mixture of national hates and a world example, there are many such in Europe, of the insolubility of the problem of national hates under capitalist rules. Perhaps the only thing to do with Vilna is to pick it up and take it only long way off and squeeze the people out into their respective nations and then put the town itself in the museum. That actually she is quoting an American diplomat who suggested that that's the only one way to solve the problem. Now, and in the way, of course, the city became to some extent a museum because during the war and after the war, it was completely more or less depopulated and repopulated through that process by people, by mostly Lithuanians and Russians, and depopulated from Jewish and Polish inhabitants. Now, most of the Jewish inhabitants obviously were killed, and Polish inhabitants were what they call repatriated to Poland. I want to talk a little bit about the notion of translation and how I see this related to the city. So, Vilnius. So the word translation is a Latin. It's from English, but it's a Latin base, and it's have several meanings. One is this to express something into another language, systematically retaining the original sense. So I think that's the very important part, retaining the original sense. The second is to change the form, condition, and nature, so to speak. So that actually is not necessarily retaining the original sense. Then is to move relics from one place to another. And this is the kind of like, to me, this is one of the most fascinating, perhaps, topics in relationship to Vilnius, this kind of mobility of relics. And unfortunately, I don't think that I have a time to dwell on that today, but But if there's any form of translation, so to speak, outside the linguistics translation that shapes the city, is specifically this form of relic mobility in the city. So the dead in the city, if you want to call that, or relics in the city, still plays a very important role in shaping and forming the sort of notion of heritage of the city. And the fourth is to convey to heaven without natural death. Now, this has just occurred a few times, actually, in sort of kind of like religious narratives. But I also almost wondered if this is sort of how you can go back into hell without a natural death and come back. So one of the aspects of sort of translation, if you want to call it, in the city is the ponar or panari, or as now Lithuanians call it, aukštieji panariai. It's the place where Nazis had a mass killings of the local population. And out of the basically probably about 90,000 people, about 60,000 people killed were Jews, and about 20,000 people were Poles. Some 10,000 or plus numbers I know of Soviet prisoners of war, but also some Lithuanians or whatever. So in a way, this is the biggest gravesite, if you want to call, of the city of Vilnius. And this is where probably a lot of the sort of memory translations is occurring. So today, it's a site where there are many commemorative places, including like for different ethnic groups in a way. So again, the city is not, or the place is not commemorative at the singularity of the losses, but in a way is actually kind of a separating into different, if you want to call it, even linguistic group. So the loss through this through Holocaust of Yiddish language and way it was a tremendous, and this is actually one of the aspects that I would like to show you in the next clip that brings this notion how to bring this sort of language that has been lost completely, where very much was part of the city, if you want to call it, was the soul of the city, into the play. I assembled this video about Yiddish language in Vilnius from Yiddish Book Center, which is in Massachusetts, and sort of have compiled this mini little voices of Yiddish, if you want to call. So some of the voices are from people who grew up in the city and went back. Some of the voices are from the Yiddish students who went out to study Yiddish. And some of the voices are from people who live in the city. So it's let's just watch it, and then after that, hopefully we can have a little bit of conversation.
Wir haben alle gekannt Polish. Wir haben gemusst kennen Polish, weil als man geht in eine Bank oder auf Post oder als man muss etwas fragen bei Poliziant, muss man fragen auf Polish. Aber wir haben gekannt Polish, nur gelebt haben wir auf Jiddisch. Wir haben nicht nur gewohnt in Vilna, aber gelebt auf Jiddisch. Gelebt auf Jiddisch, getracht auf Jiddisch, geholmt auf Jiddisch, fantasiert auf Jiddisch.
Wir sind gekommen und gelebt in Vilna. Es war sehr schwer zu kommen in Vilna, weil alles gewesen vernichtet. Alle Menschen, die alte Freunde, sind schon gewöhnt, die Freunde. Das ist gewöhnt nicht leicht. Aber wir kommen verschiedene neue Jiden. Aber ich habe schon nicht gelernt Jiddisch, weil sie nicht gewöhnt, als Jiddisch gewöhnt vernichtet. Aber gelernt in der russischen Gymnasium. Aber sehr wichtig zu sagen, wegen Jiddisch, wegen Jiden haben wir allemal geredet. Das ist gewöhnt sehr wichtig. Und eine Spezifik da von Vilna und von Litauen, haben Iden nicht gehabt, mehr zu reden, offener von Gas, Jiddisch. Im ganzen Sowjetverband ist nicht gewesen in Russland. Alle haben gehabt mehr. Aber in Ivrit ist nicht gewesen kein Rede, weil man gesetzt in Turme. Aber in Vilnius haben die Iden sich getroffen ins Gas und nicht gehabt mehr bis Ende zu reden Yiddish.
There are parts of the old Jewish quarter that are very much physically intact, and it was kind of a very powerful experience to just kind of walk in those streets, because it's still, unlike, let's say, Warsaw, where virtually the entire Jewish quarter was leveled with the destruction of the ghetto. There was a lot of damage in certain parts of the city in Vilna, the old city, but there's certain streets that are still there, and you can walk down these narrow streets, and it's just like you read about in Grada or something. And then you come to the part, this area that was the Schulhof, the synagogue courtyard, that was the most fabled, a part of the old city, and it's that was completely leveled really by the Soviets. And there's a school there, and I think now there's some kind of statue, but at the time, there was nothing.
Wir begonnen zu spazieren und ich habe gewusst, mehr oder weniger, wo unser Hotel ist. Es ist nicht gewesen in Gegend, was ist mir gewesen gut bekannt, aber ich habe gewusst, wie zu gehen zu einer Gegend, was ist mir gut bekannt. Die sind 3 Minuten herum, bin ich gewesen in einer Gegend, wo es mir gut bekannt. Und aber das ist gewesen eine unglaubliche Überlebung von mir, weil alles ist gewesen bekannt. Und in einem gewissen Moment habe ich aufgehört zu gehen auf Gassen, und ich habe angegeben, durchzuschneiden über Häufen. Weil ich habe gedacht, ich habe gewusst, wo ich von nach Hause komme, ist in dem Moment, mit der Überlebung habe ich verstanden, als in Vilna kann ich nicht verloren gehen. Ich kenne die Stadt zu gut.
Auf der Gas, welche Sprachen pflegt man Herren in Vilna?
Auf der Gas pflegt man Herren als Jiddisch, Russisch und Polnisch. Nicht kein Litwisch. Litwisch pflegt man nicht Herren in Vilna, weil auch die Litwiner reden Polnisch oder Russisch. Und es ist gar nicht gewesen, als es eine größere Zahl Litwiner in Vilna. Es ist gewesen von mir sehr, sehr, sehr modern. Ich bin gegangen in der Gas in Vilna und habe gehört Litwisch. Das bin ich in die letzten Zeiten, wenn ich bin gekommen in Vilna. Es ist gewesen, als ich wollte zurückkommen von da in Boston, und mit einmal alle reden Chinesisch. Also hat es so gesagt.
On the first day of a tour, we meet Fanny Bronsovsky. She's getting this tour, and it was like walking around with a time machine. It was just amazing. And she shows us, buildings, and talks about what she remembered of her youth and what the buildings were and her school. And we'd go around in the afternoon and see where some of the same people lived, and then we'd see where some of the same people were murdered. At the same time, I'm meeting all these incredible young people from around the world studying Yiddish for different reasons. I remember, talking to Fania one afternoon. She went to a very sophisticated high school in Yiddish in the city, and there are very few people left who speak the language there, and people are coming, and she has to teach them the alphabet and, remind them that, the difference between two different letters that look similar. And I said, what do you think of this? And she said, I'm so honored that people come here to listen to me.
Ich habe gar nichts gewusst wegen Birne. Ich habe gehört kein Birne. Und wir haben Wir sind gegangen zu Ponar und es ist sehr, sehr schwer für mich, weil ja, etliche Menschen haben geschreit in Ponar oder geweint. Und es ist sehr schwer zu sehen, das, weil ja, sie sind wie Haberium in unserem Programm und wir lernen sich zusammen, Patriarchal. Und habe ich nicht gesehen, sie zu schreien. Und ich bin Agoi und ich kann nicht verstehen, wie jeden Tag viel in Ponar.
I didn't allow myself to enjoy Lithuania as a country. I felt a real antipathy towards it. I was blindsided by the omnipresence of the Holocaust there because my family had left before the Holocaust, and you know the first 2 weeks you're there, you're making all these trips. You're doing a trip to Ponar, to these or you get a tour of the Vilna ghetto. You hear stories about this, the sliver of Jewish community that's left in the city now, and the fact that they don't always have the easiest time about persistent kind of anti-Semitism, and it's just like I wanted to be like I'm here to study Yiddish. I'm here to have this little world, and I feel like to enjoy the country would be a betrayal of that. I felt a lot more. When you talked early in the interview about tensions between different identities, I felt those tensions, and I felt like I'm a partisan in all the sense of the word, on behalf of the Jews that summer. And I think if I could go back now, I think I could look at it with a slightly larger lens.
Durchgehen die Gassen und sehen, wo es gewinnen. Theater, wo es gewinnt der Turm, wo Jena hat gelebt, wo gerade geschrieben wegen der Agonie, wo ist das erste Mal, sehe ich alle lebendige sportliche Stadt in Vilnius, in Center Stadt, sehr europäisch und ganz Menschen sehen uns ganz bequem, der Raum ist sehr enorm, aber in Vilnius und die Ironie ist, als in die alte jüdische Geslach, die arme Geslach hat man sehr remontiert, mit einem Luxus, als die jüdische Geslach haben käme, als ein Luxus nicht gehabt, geht man durch die Geslach und man will sich der Monen geschichtlich, Leute der Literatur und Leute Artikeln, was da ist gewesen, und man darf auch abnehmen die neue, frische Kleidung, was man das mal kleidet, und wieder verstehen durch jüdische Augen, was wir einmal gewesen. Aber das ist von mir ein Überleben. Ich habe gekannt, nehmen, verstehen, wie es hat geklappt, ein jüdisches Leben zusammen mit einem polnischen Leben, zusammen mit einem litwinischen Leben, zusammen mit einem russischen Leben, wie es hat ausgekannt zusammenklappen.
auf Jiddisch, das Schwierigkeit. Ich habe gesagt, man darf auf das gucken. Ich schaue nicht sehr tragisch, aber das ist der Guru. Von jedweder Sprache, welche ordnet, sein Meluche. Und als solches Beispiel habe ich als die Sprachen vorbei. Noch ein Dorf. Jene Sprache ordnet zu dem großen Bagage von Literatur, von der historischen Wirtschaft, ich habe im Sinne.
Ich bin geboren da, aber man hat zu mir allemal gesagt, was, ihr seid noch nicht gewesen in Vilnius, was, ihr seid nicht gefahren in Vilnius. 2 Jahre zurück, wir sind alle, ich, Rena und Adas, sind gefahren in Vilnius mit der Gruppe. Wir sind gewesen in Erden, was der Tate hat geschrieben seine Lieder. Der Tate hat geschrieben im Ghetto. Und hat mir allemal erzählt. Ich bin gesessen auf dem Balkon und ein paar Wörter bei mir sind raus. Unter deinem. Und von dem ist raus noch Wörter und noch Wörter. Und die Lied ist geworden, also nicht, wir können nicht glauben, was solche Wörter unter deine weiße Stern, was der Tate hat geschrieben im Ghetto, was hat nicht geglaubt, dass es wird kriegen, also, wie hat gesagt, also Starkheit, a große Lied. Man übersetzt das in alle Sprachen.
Unter deine weiße Stern streckt zu mir dein weiße Hand. Meine Wörter seinen Tränen willen ruhen in dein Hand. Seh es dunkelt, sehr finkel in mein kellerdicken Blick. Und ich hab gar nicht kein Winkel, sie zu schenken dir zurück.
Okay, so here's my finishing sort of like thoughts, or actually questions perhaps you can help me to figure out, because my question would be to still trying to find out how to put that sort of kind of like those narratives, songs, poems, that's Yiddish, into the place, into actual sort of place of contemporary Vilnius. So how to make this lost and tangible, if you want to call heritage that exists in the universe, because it's a written language and it exists in all its richness in many ways outside the city, and it's permanent, if you want to call it, how to place and how to make part of this tangible city and this heritage of city, integrate the two, and basically how to make Yiddish language in Vilnius visible. Okay, so maybe we can have a little bit of a conversation or discussion or questions.
Well, thank you very much. You have finished with a big question about how to make the intangible, unseen or forgotten memories and histories visible again. How to make invisible visible again, which is, I think, very, very, very difficult, if not almost impossible, because what is invisible is brought by people. However, we still can have some, let's say, probably political decision what to bring to public space, what to not, and what to bring and what kind of physical representation certain ideas or values can have a form, what kind of physical form they have. And I think in the cities or places like Vilnius, with this overlapping narratives, as you prefer to call it, it's quite important not to let those traces to be forgotten. Krakow is probably a different story. Of course, the Jewish population was also assassinated during the Second World War. Now the Jewish community is very small, but those remnants, those relics of a Jewish past in the form of wall advertisement of different companies written in Yiddish, this is still visible in a few places. Yes, nowadays those signs are being conserved and or at least they are more visible. But there's it's a difficult, very difficult task how to make those this past to be visible. Visible again, and in fact we can discuss Vilnius is one case, but of course we have many places around Central Europe where cities, towns, villages were depopulated and repopulated again with newcomers, and how to read the landscape. How to see, how to make people aware of the layers of history. How to make people aware of the former citizens, of their presence, of their heritage. This is we at least in Poland we have so many places of that kind. In the eastern part, there are villages with void from lack of Jewish communities. In the western part, there is and the areas around Mazury, yes, Borussia, Warmia, and Mazury regions with without or regions with former German population, and it is in a public let's say discourse, you can't easily read those layers of history. In big cities, yes, in like cities like Wrocław, it has, I think, agreed to its own German history. Szczecin is also, I think, in the process of reconciliation with its past. But well, I think it is quite a challenging task, and but it's good to pose these questions. Yes.
I think inevitably it's probably it's going to be a form of translation. So in the way you have to, it's one thing is, as I started from Vancouver, perhaps the one thing to throw people who live in the city understand that there are other linguistics, if you want to call realities. And I think the tendency is what to me it's a little bit makes me always discomforting. The tendency is to say that here's the history and here's the present, where in fact, like an example, and it's not even necessarily Yiddish in Vilnius case. It also could be arguably with Polish and Belarusian and all other kinds of linguistic narratives. But there's a tendency to separate the past, so to tendency to present. This is the past, and it's always much easier to deal with the past in a way because you can rearrange and however you feel like. And I think this is, you just commemorate something or put memorial, whatever plaques or something like that, and it's done deal. I always feel very discomforting about that. This is to me not what the cities are. So in the way. With Yiddish Vilna, if you want to call that, it does exist. It has this richness of literature. It has this richness of, if you want to call imaginative or something like that. So it exists, if you want to call in fiction. It exists somewhere above or something like that. So how to take it down, so to speak, from the above and to connect it. So the only one form, of course, it's probably some kind of a translation that when you it becomes part of the Lithuanian narrative in many ways. It integrates into that.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, you lose something in that process tremendously. You lose the language, basically, that is part of the city's identity, not just heritage, but identity. But then also perhaps there is, through that process, perhaps, if you lose something, at least you gain that, because people would not think in these separate categories that this is kind of a Jewish Vilna or Vilnius, this is kind of like, this and that or whatever. And to me, that's the most troubling aspect, this compartmentalization. in heritage. That and so we know that the past is a foreign country, so to speak. In Vilnius, it's actually a foreign country, and in many cases, foreign language even. So how to make something that is perceived to be foreign, not to claim it ownership, but to perceive to be owner part of you. How to sort of integrate something that for generations has been told that this is not, it's impossible to do it, or even unnecessary to do it.
Yes, this is something. This is a process that we should call to inherit. Yes, to be heirs with full responsibility and awareness for the heritage, and not necessarily. I mean, you are not obliged to add Jewish past to your identity, but to be aware that you inherit something from the past which might be important for the future. So this is the process of building awareness of certain things, but that's something quite difficult and utopian in a sense, but of course we need that kind of utopias too.
We need, I think, utopia, otherwise we, especially these days.
Well, I'm afraid there is no. I'm checking on my wonderful.
That's okay.
On my wonderful device. But I'm afraid that there are no questions. I think that everybody was somehow
it's a long day.
Astonished or even somehow caught by this oral history and in the film that you post. So well, no comments. But anyway, thank you very much for this for this inspirational.
Okay, thank you.
Not many people put question in the end of their presentation. So thank you for this question in the end.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And please, yes, we have one from Alexandra. You see?
Somehow.
In southern Italy, there are villages of Riace and Camini, which were repopulated by refugees, and currently they are involved in local Catholic traditions, which would suggest that the newcomers from distant traditions might be a hope for such places. Well,
that's interesting, and I think that's more relevant perhaps like for Vancouver or something like that, because the reality is that in Vancouver, as you said, this notion of inheritance, it's not just who call the heritage of this colonial, so to speak, past or something like that, but it's also newcomers who constantly come into a city and settle. So they do have that carry that heritage too. So it's a double, so to speak, formula. In many ways, I would argue that, and as you know, as in Poland, in many ways, Vilnius is also quite immigrant city, to be honest. So in the way, it's not on that level. That's completely, but there is a population moving in, and in a way, mostly by now Lithuanian population. But I think it's they need to, so to speak, take it something that is not even they need to take it, inherit literally something that's by now kind of distant from them quite substantially.
Well, another comment is just people thank you for the interesting presentation and important research. So just I'm forwarding the positive feedback.
Okay, well,
So
it's hard without this audience and whatever.
Very
so
hard,
very,
very hard. 2 years ago at our 5th Heritage Forum of Central Europe, we had a meeting with Krystyna Zabaliauskaite, and we had the forum was, of course, in a let's say traditional format, and we invited her for a conversation in the end of one day, and we had full room here. With the room can accommodate up to 200 people, and there was this interesting, important and this mood, this atmosphere. And of course, people were also queuing to ask her to sign her book. Even it was still before the third part of Silvarerum. That was the third part was released just this February. So it was something in the middle. So I wish we could have a meeting with you with this book published in Polish, but
some next year or something or whatever, in 2 years maybe or something like.
Yeah, we'll see. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice day, because I understand it's a very early.
Yes, and you enjoy your summer evening. So, great. Thank you very much. So, bye.
Thank you, and hope to see you one day here in Krakow at the main market square.
Definitely, I hope that too. So that's it.
I also want to thank all our listeners and followers for presence and for interaction during today's speeches and presentations and panel discussions. And we will see each other tomorrow. We start a little bit later at 10 o'clock with the discussion on heritage management in Visegrad countries. We will then, this discussion will be moderated by Dr. Michał Wiśniewski. Later on, we will have another set of parallel sessions. And in the end, at 6 o'clock, I would like to invite you for the final experts debate on the more future-oriented discussion about what will we do and how we will be doing after pandemic. We will talk with director Alicja Knast from Prague, Irena Kregar-Szegota from Rijeka, and Robert Piaskowski from Kraków. So see you tomorrow, and thank you very much for your presence today. Goodbye.